Do we need to wait for you? Yeah. Okay, so this is now being recorded, which is fantastic. So thank you all for joining this session. We've got an hour 45, and we're going to be touching on some of the challenges and priorities in EOSC. I'm going to give a few personal viewpoints. I flagged that these are personal viewpoints. It doesn't represent the board, even though I'm on the board of directors. And it's really just to set the scene for the session. We'll then have 5 panelists who are going to reflect on 3 questions, and we're going to invite contributions from you as we go along as well. So do reflect on that as we go through. Think about what you think the challenges are, raise them in chat. We'll also invite you to raise your hand and contribute. So the first thing I wanted to start with is something you've probably already seen, where we're headed with EOSC. What we're trying to develop is this web of fair data and services, federating the e-infrastructures and the research infrastructures. So we have this environment in which we can bring together data with all the tools so that researchers can perform their analysis and address the societal challenges. And we've got this very nice graphic that came out of the previous EOS governance. I think it's a really beautiful vision. It sounds very simple, but it's actually extremely hard in reality. And what I want to reflect on is some of those issues that we face. I think where we're trying to get to is that EOS works like a core utility. You know, we want it to run like water, like gas, electric. You know, the light should come on when you press a switch. We should have the water flowing when we open the tap. And users come to rely on that. It just functions for them. And they can be ignorant of the complexities under the hood. I don't know how the grid works, so I just want my electricity to work. But it takes a huge amount of time and effort to reach that stage of maturity. And I think primarily one of the key challenges we face in EOSC is that we're very much still in the build phase. And this means that often things don't flow very well yet. And I also fear that it means we're exposing a lot of information that's irrelevant to end users. They don't really care about the implementation choices we're making. They just want something that works for them. And at worst, what may happen is that a user comes to EOSC and they try something and they fail. Maybe they can't access the data. They try and use a service and it doesn't work. And we run the risk that they might not come back to EOSC if we put things out that aren't fully functional and ready at that time. So I think that's something we have to be really careful with. The other kind of challenge we face is that EOSC is essentially multi-everything. This is a multi-stakeholder initiative. We naturally have all the research funders involved because, they're the people who've defined this vision and invested in it. We're trying to work across all of Europe, so it's multi-country. That means we're bringing in lots of different languages. We're also working across all of the different disciplines. And I think there's probably umpteen more kind of multi-dimensions that we could flag. And each of these aspects adds a layer of complexity. And it also means that we're having to bring together lots of different people, different practices. And that means that it takes an incredibly large amount of time to build a consensus and move forward. And it's important that we do build that consensus, because you're not going to get the buy-in from people if you don't take the time to actually figure out something that's a good approach for all. One of the other issues I think we face is that in my opinion, we've placed the cart before the horse. And this isn't to criticize the European Commission or others, because I think they've done a fantastic job, investing in EOSC and funding lots of projects. But we have in the past few years really had quite a messy or organic formation through a series of projects. And I think even with the best will in the world, it's quite hard to coordinate across those because they're funded by different directorates. Everybody's responding to calls and defining their own work plans. And, we might have overlaps in activities, we might have duplicated activities, or we might have things that just don't naturally come together. The governance of EOSC was actually only formed in 2018. The executive board was an expert group. So that meant we had an advisory role, not authority. We weren't defining what projects did. The projects had their own work plans. But it also meant at times we didn't even know what was going on in the projects. We didn't have sight of the work plans. So it's very hard to provide any kind of guidance or steer. And it's still kind of to be defined how the EOSC Association collaborates with the core infrastructure providers and the main projects. Under Horizon Europe, there is an expectation that projects will work with the association. I think that's fantastic. And I'm hoping that we can, develop really close working relationships with them. This is something we've already started with the EOSC Future project, having meetings between the board and the project. And I think slowly we will kind of move that cart back behind the horse, and we'll be able as a community to try and help steer the direction we're taking and have a much more kind of coordinated and coherent EOSC that forms. And for me, the priorities, the kind of what would be on my to-do list is testing, more testing, and also iterating in response to user feedback. I don't feel like we've really engaged the research community enough, listened to their views, and also responded to those views. I know, having run kind of software development projects myself before, when you've designed something and you think it's a perfect design and your developers have, really worked hard and you think this is the best approach, it's quite hard to take the criticism when a user just looks at it blankly and says, no, that doesn't work. I would never use it in that way, or this doesn't fit my practice. But I think we have to take on board, real user feedback and be a lot more incremental in our approach to how we're building and co-designing EOSC. So working, with one small thing at a time, releasing it, getting feedback, making sure things are fully functional, because otherwise we have the risk that, people will disengage because they find that EOSC doesn't serve their needs. So I think we have to be very collaborative and consensus driven. And one of the things that I would really like to stress is that we need to have a very effective stakeholder forum and use it. In the previous EOS governance diagram, there was this block of the stakeholder forum, and within all of the projects from EOS pilot through, there have been various ways to engage the stakeholders through things like the liaison platform that was done by the Secretariat. But I don't think we've really got, one kind of model or one coherent way to engage the user community. And that's a gap for me that I think we need to fill. And there's opportunities to do that. Within the EOSC Future project, for example, there will be this kind of registry of users that we use. And I think there's also a key role for the EOSC Association here to try and build that forum and make sure that we can get all the user feedback and all the stakeholder views in. So I know I've maybe been a little bit critical and people may not agree with all those views, but I do honestly believe that together we can make this work. There's a kind of tripartite structure that's been proposed for EOSC. This is my view of it. I think the EOSC Association plays a really key role to try and bring in all of those different stakeholder views, but also to work in close collaboration with all of the implementers, whether that be, EOSC projects under Horizon Europe, or commercial service providers, or initiatives that are funded by different member states. And together, I think the association and the service providers are really doing the work under the hood to create this EOSC platform, which works for research communities. And it's the research communities that I would place at the center, because it's their needs we need to respond to. So we have to really understand the working practices, what it is they need from EOSC, and find a way to deliver on that. And as I mentioned before, the importance of the stakeholder forum, I think this is something that the EOSC Association should be playing a key role in, to kind of generate this forum and to make sure that we represent all of the different interests, the EC, the member states, different funders, research performing organizations, and industry, and obviously research communities as well. So that's my starter for 10, my views on this, but I am just one voice. I've invited a panel of 5 people today to represent various different stakeholder groups. So we're going to hear from Ingrid Dillo, who's from DANS and representing the FAIRS Fair project. So this is a data archive in the Netherlands for social sciences. So we're hearing from that research community. We also have Rudolf Dimper from the European Synchrotron radiation facility. So again, representing research infrastructure and research communities. We'll hear from Shalini Kurapati, who's a data steward at Politecnico di Torino and also representing Clearbox AI. So we're hearing here the kind of research views, but also the support needs from them. Owen Appleton from EGI, representing kind of e-infrastructure views, and Hilary Hanahoe from the Research Data Alliance. So bringing in some of those international perspectives and also how you can run fora where you can try and build that community consensus. And I think we already saw in the opening session that some of the models that RDA have are very relevant to EOSC as well, and how we set up our task forces. So there are 3 questions that I've defined for the panel. The first one is, what are their top 3 challenges facing EOSC? The second one is about the key priority actions that we should be focusing on. And the third one is, if they had a magic wand and could change one thing to make EOSC better, what would that be? And the way we're going to run this session, I'm trying to see if I'm on time. I am just on time. I'm just within 10 minutes. We're going to take each question in turn. We'll have 15 minutes where the panel reflect in turn, and then we'll have audience response for 10 minutes. So by all means, put things in the chat. I will also invite you to raise a hand, but I think given how many people are on the call, I'll limit you to 1 hand raise per person. So use your question or comment wisely. And then at the end, we've got 20 minutes for a Mentimeter where these questions are going to be put to you as well. So that's all I had to say. Has that stopped sharing screen? No, I will stop sharing screen now so I can come back and see the panel. I'm going to go ladies first. So I'm going to start with the first question, going to Ingrid, and then I'll go along the panel.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for your excellent presentation. And I think you encompass many, many challenges that we face. So I think I will be reiterating some of those. I think from this morning's session, following the chat, it was clear that there was a lot of emphasis on the big technical and semantic interoperability challenges that we face. But I'd like to concentrate on a couple of challenges that I see that are not so much technical. I think that, and that was clear very much to me yesterday in the presentations, the complexity of the EOSC is immense, and to my mind, it is still growing. It's often referred to as a journey. I am convinced that we still do not have one shared vision of what EOS actually is or should be. So it's complex in many, many ways. The governance with this new tripartite approach, the infrastructure with the different layers, the tension between the timelines of the again, I think of the task forces and the new calls and the project definitions, but also elements like language that you mentioned, very often I think overlooked and underestimated as well. And I think it has a huge effect on inclusiveness, because that is something that I am worried about. And also I think that we tend to forget that although we are with 260 participants now in this call, that we really are a very small in-crowd, an in-crowd of relatively well-informed people who talk to each other sometimes in what is almost a coded language. So all of this means, I think, that we run a real risk of losing parts of Europe that are still less connected, but also maybe part of the long tail of science, of research that is not so well represented by European research infrastructures and clusters. So worry about inclusiveness because of this complexity is one of my top challenges. Another one, and that's not that is a familiar one, is the research focus. If we envisage this EOSC as a web of fair data and services, as we like to say, then it should worry us, I think, that in Europe, only 5% of the researchers at universities claim that they have a high awareness of the FAIR principles. So I think putting more effort in awareness raising and training is paramount. And we also need to engage with them in the context of the creation, of course, of EOSC. So that their needs become really the starting point for our services development. And I'm very aware that this is all easier said than done. And then my third challenge would be the long-term sustainability of that web of fair data. Because we are all very busy in making data fair within EOS, we also need to keep them fair. The importance of long-term preservation and stewardship of data has always been, I think, reflected and acknowledged in all kinds of policy documents, you know, from your own Turning Fair into Reality report, Sarah, to the SRIA. But in practice, very little progress has been made, I think, with respect to the implementation of that vital aspect of EOSC. And sometimes I think it's a bit of a hot potato that's being moved around from plate to plate because it's also probably a costly affair. But I really think that that is one of the challenges that we need to solve in the coming years if we really want the investment that we put in fair data to last over time. So those are my three, with inclusiveness on as a top priority.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I'll come to Rudolf next.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for excellent presentations. I'm really with you on a couple of aspects, in particular this idea of making things work and then release them and such to be able to forget about them, have them really as a basic service. So that's very important, I think. Now I'm coming from this big research infrastructure, which I have in the back of my picture here, a picture of that, the ESRF. We are faced with users coming to us with their tiny samples, which are put into extremely brilliant beam, and that generates awful amounts of data. So we face the situation that these researchers, these scientists are using our infrastructures for a short part in their research cycle. It sometimes takes years to prepare the sample, and then it takes a very long time to analyze the data. And they do this going from one facility to another one, collecting data, and they have to combine these data. This is why I think, one of the top challenges, the first one I would really make rock solid in EOSC is the AAI infrastructure. Without that, we can't really do a lot. We need something which looks like a room where people can use it and connect to resources seemingly. Now, this and one aspect of AI, which we shouldn't forget, is that identities need to be managed persistently. If we don't do that, we have a real issue with our data policies, where we have embargo periods where people need to cite the originators of the data set. We have to be able to identify people, although researchers, as we all know, they change very often their affiliations, and this has to be traced. So we have to make sure that we keep trace of identities, and that is not only the technical challenge of interconnecting the AI infrastructure, but also the operational challenge of keeping these identities up to date and link them to authorization to access resources. So that's the first one. The second thing which we really could and should address with high priority is to ensure that people can find the data. We are far from that. I think that most of the data in Europe, it may already be sort of prepared for fairness, but it's not yet visible. We can't search for it, and we certainly can't search for it with a single command, Google-like, show me the data concerning this and this protein, for instance. So this is what we definitely need this, so I would say we need an EOSC data search engine, which works really well and which satisfies the people who look for something. And then the third part, I would say, is as we face more and more data coming out of research these days, and the data is more and more complex, I think we have to provide access to physical IT infrastructure without big barriers. It has to be easy to get hold of IT resources beyond the desktop PC or the laptop, such that data sets can be combined, that data sets can be visualized and further analyzed. So this is then, that would be a fundamental building block, and also that people take it up, that the services we have like AI, like data search, then can be used by scientists. And I think that if you have easy access to IT resources, the scientists will come there because they need it. They more than ever need access to IT resources. So I think that we need these basic building blocks of EOSC in place, rock solid and reliable. It implies that the IT specialists are available to assist and accompany the researchers. We can't leave them alone. They need assistance because things are complex, but we also have to ensure that they don't need to understand what's under the hood, as you say, Sarah. So one of the issues of obviously, which is directly linked to this, is how we construct and operate the EOSC help desk to make that really happen. And I think would we focus on this and only on this, then the higher level games of, for instance, cross-disciplinary research would come as time goes by and naturally. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rudolf. I agree these building blocks need to be in place and solid. So the third up is Shalini.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the thought-provoking presentation that you had started this session with. And I'm also probably going to reiterate a couple of challenges, but I'll try to put my perspective because I'm wearing two hats now. One as a research data management support professional at Politecnico di Torino from Italy. And I'm also running an SME, a startup. So my thoughts here might be a bit more pragmatic about the challenges. The first one would be the awareness and engagement that related to research communities. So if researchers are the main users, how engaged are they at this moment? Right now, it seems quite complex and confusing about what's happening in EOSC, what is EOSC, and that would be the biggest challenge in terms of how aware are researchers and how engaged they are in this whole process. And the second one would be, how are we going to sell it to them? I mean, I'm talking it as a, so what's the benefit for them to use this? I can give you an example, like we wanted to develop a software and put it into production. And we met one of the big tech US cloud service providers. We just had to click some buttons and our software was up and running and we could run our analysis within a few days, obviously. And there was somebody who we could book and they could optimize all our services and make sure that it was working well. So more than the infrastructure, we also need to be, the challenges is that what are the services that are available for the end users? Because these companies are also targeting researchers. They're going to department and saying, hey, use our compute services. We'll also provide you extra support. So how are we going to look into that? So it's really about how do we sell this? What is the value? What's the added value they have beyond the existing research infrastructures they're using? And the third one, coming from a University of Technology, we have a big issue of discipline-specific standards, for especially in the engineering and technology domain. So how are we going to overcome that? And those would be my three main aspects. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Shalini. Yeah, I think you're right. Things have to work well, and be easy to configure for users and have a good value proposition for them. So especially because commercial enterprises do this so well. So next up is Owen Appleton.
Hi, thanks, Sarah, again. Like everyone, I liked your slides. I like provocative. I think it helps. So I think there's kind of the three bits that really occurred to me as the key challenges are a user part, a provider part, and a kind of overall confidence part. On the user part, I think I agree with Ingrid. In fact, for all of this, these aren't technical challenges. In fact, I haven't heard technical challenges. It's more policy, community, organization. We have great technical people. We know they can do good things. It's getting it all stitched together. On the user side, if we don't have users, we won't exist. I mean, it is pretty simple. There has been a real jump forward, I think, having a closer relationship for me as an infrastructure person with the clusters, because I really understand their perspective a lot more. Although I also have to remember that they aren't all researchers. I mean, I think Rudolf is closer to the researchers than most, but the ESRF clusters are still service providers, but they're just subject specific and those so have a better relationship to users. But still, we need to get to user concerns, and we can't do it just by inviting them to meetings because they don't want to discuss the same things as us. If I think about rules of participation, which I'm involved with, I could invite a user to those meetings, but would they really see the impact of the discussions we were having? Their concerns are, can I do my research? And there's some interpretation needed to kind of bridge that gap. Plus, with the users, we have some problems in a lot of research, I mean, outside of things like COVID or climate change, where we all know we need big integrated solutions. For the long tail, for smaller communities, we're not that critical sometimes. They can do it more slowly on their own laptop or on local resources. So unless we make things very easy to use, people won't necessarily pick up our solutions. Even if they're good, they'll take a less efficient solution that they understand. So we have to somehow work out how to address them. On the provider side, there's a lot of work that's been done, but the big question remains, how do people get paid? And I think this is one of the massive missing pieces. What is the structure which allows for there to be a mandate for cross-border service delivery, or outside of your regular mandate service delivery by a provider, which gets you reimbursed for that usage? Otherwise, we're just a series of islands serving the communities we already did. And I think that has to come from work lobbying and working with funding agencies and the nations, because they're the ones who can say, yes, it is okay for you to use your university funds to serve research in another country because somehow you're going to get paid back. I know this is a big question, but if we don't have it, I think once the projects stop, and we know they're stopping, I don't know how many services will have an EOSC, which would be really worrying. Still, I think if we can do both of those things, the last question is really, how do we keep everyone's confidence while we're fixing this complicated situation? Because on both sides, there's a lot of concern about directions this is going. Everyone is, I think, working hard and trying to do this correctly, but there's still a challenge to keep everyone on board while we make sure that the boat is heading in the right direction and providing use to people. So I think those are my top challenges.
Excellent, thanks very much. Now I'm going to come finally to Hilary, but also to flag to you, I will open it to the floor after Hilary. So if anyone wants to raise a hand, by all means, start thinking about your comments now.
Thanks, Sarah. Of course, my colleagues on the panel have covered some of the points, but when I was thinking about your good questions, I thought I could look back over about 10 years ago. And actually, there was a reference to it yesterday by Costas, and he was directly involved in it on the Riding the Wave report. And recently, the Portuguese presidency discussed or used the name to Riding the Next Wave of research data. They say this report referred to it in scientific data. But why am I looking at that to talk about the challenges today? That report was published in October 2010 with a 20-year vision. So, and it's really quite valid, some of the challenges for what we're talking about today. Some have been achieved. Interestingly, clouds and open science were never referenced in that report. But a lot of the challenges and the whole, European Open Science Cloud concept, if you like, was in there. They talked about a scientific e-infrastructure, but it had 8 different visions and things. So as it happens, my challenges for EOSC do tie in with those. So the first one, of course, is the user aspect. And they said, work with real users and build according to their requirements. And I think this, Sarah, goes a little bit between it's this compromise that we need to identify between getting something perfect so we don't, what you mentioned in your opening as well, getting something perfect so we don't lose the interest, so we don't lose the trust, and we don't lose, but on the other hand, iteratively, putting it out and getting it tested, and feedback loops. And I know that in the EOSC Future project, there are plans for that, and there can never be too much. It's complex, but I think that it's very important, and I will do a shout out for the EOSC Future project user registry, because there is an activity there. Sarah mentioned it, and there's an opportunity for users to get involved and to really interact, and there will be mechanisms in the project for that. So that's my first one, is users. My second one is incentives to use it and to reuse it around, trust, quality, security, those sort of aspects. So there's a lot of emphasis on incentives in the Horizon Europe program. Some touch on it, but I wonder how much that will be borne in mind while this EOSC is being, if you like, implemented, and how can these incentives really be sure that they're built in? So Rudolf sort of alluded to it in his thing, and I think that will, if you like, show the value to the researchers and the users. So what are the incentives though for that? And do we have the mechanisms in place, or do we have to start looking for new ones, you know? And then, of course, last but not least is the interoperability. For me, of course, it's a huge challenge. I think we all know that it's mentioned and things, but it's not, we're not there yet with the interoperability. And I think it's also that aspect of it. Incentives are tied to the interoperability because the researchers are doing their science and their research, you know? So how do we also incentivize them to, you know, structure their data, to make it available, their research outputs in a way that's valuable for some other you know, community or use. Yeah? And if I may, I'm going to read something really quickly from the Riding the Wave, because I think it's an interesting use case. And I'm fascinated by it because it was written 10 years ago, and who would have known? And bear with me, but this is a result of a virtual world. I now have to wear glasses when I read. But it says, an epidemiologist in Geneva studying the latest flu virus will benefit greatly from being able to tap easily into DNA databases in London of 1918 Spanish flu victims. And the epidemiologist's work should be accessible to a public health official in Hong Kong, a systems biologist in San Diego, and a medical historian in Boston. That's all possible today, but with great effort, skill, cost, and time. A leap forward in interoperability will change that. So that's a really, I mean, who would have thought, no, with COVID? And I think that we can all see the progress that COVID has forced us to make in terms of open science and availability. And we should and can, I think, leverage on that. But I was fascinated that that wonderful high-level expert group included a use case around that is so true and valid for us today. So they're my three.
Excellent, thanks. And yeah, it's interesting the foresight they clearly had in that report. Now, nobody's been bold enough to raise a hand, so I'm going to try and summarize what's been said both by the panel and the chat while somebody maybe wants to offer a reflection. So by all means, raise your hand if you want to. But I think, as we've heard, there are many kind of technical challenges, so things like the AAI, the data search that have been flagged by Rudolf. Interoperability, I think this came up in the earlier session today. This is really the biggest nut to crack. But actually, many of the challenges we face are more the kind of policy and the social side. And I think I've always felt that. That's kind of more my background. It's not necessarily the technical aspects. It's bringing people together, getting consensus, having things, you know, kind of properly defined in policies and making them work. The user engagement seemed to be flagged quite a lot there, making sure we properly understand and build on people's requirements. And as Owen said, you know, people may use a poorer solution if it's simple and easy and something they can access and it works for them. So I think we have to really focus on the usability of EOSC. And the payment model, that's also a big challenge. I see a hands raised, so I'm going to very quickly sum up. The inclusiveness and long-term preservation also came up, and people reflected on those in the chat, and they seem to be key issues. So the first hand that's been raised is Ari. Do you want to come in and make a reflection?
Yeah, it's just something which I put in the chat, but I haven't heard much discussion about, is the role of the research performing organizations. They're the ones who are actually hiring these researchers. And from my own experience in my own university, they would be really keen on finding somebody who has ready-made services, which they could maybe tailor for their purposes. And what is also interesting is that RPOs actually would be willing to, even many cases, to pay actual money for the services if they are usable and very, very pragmatic for their own uses. And so, of course, having free is better, but I think that this is one approach which should not be forgotten when discussing about who would actually, how to get the researchers to actually use the services. If your faculty recommends it, yeah, definitely a lot of researchers will suddenly start to use it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think there's a huge positive there that actually many of the members of the EOSC Association are RPOs. I think that's a good trend and hopefully something we can tap into. But I've noticed this as well when I've worked in universities. Universities are often going out to tender, paying for services, you know, so they do have those funds available. So yeah, I think that's a key kind of mediator or group that we should be working with. Anders and then Hugh, and then we'll move on to the second question.
Thank you very much. And oops, I turn my camera on. Thank you very much. And I just want to pick up on a few actually of your original presentation, Sarah. First, the overall vision of the FAIR Internet of Affairs data and services, which I completely share, and your idea of this what we call the water and gas metaphor, something just coming from a plug in the wall, basically. So I think if you think of the internet, it's built around pretty simple building blocks and unfolding ecosystem from that. And I think we have to move in that direction as well. We have to think of EOS not just as a plethora of distinct services, but we really have to work on, Carol said this morning, convergence into an infrastructure, or we are never going to get the water gas thing working. And then we have to really focus on that infrastructure being adding something to research that's not already there. It's not just a new way to get what they already have. It has to really add a new dimension for, so the infrastructure perspective would be my bit, and of course interoperability is part of that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Hugh?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So to sort of build on some of the thoughts expressed so far, so Ingrid is absolutely right that, you know, we're this sort of very much this in crowd, and we're all sort of talking to ourselves and not reaching out enough outside. I think the other thing about that in crowd is that we all kind of see the big vision thing, the interoperability, the, you know, freely sharing data, findable data, all of these huge ideas that are going on, when of course researchers just want things to work, as been said. And it seems to me that in some respect we have to think about things in terms of, one, keeping on with that vision, but that's, you know, almost something that happens kind of within these boundaries here. But then almost to think about the things that we present to researchers, or indeed to universities, as Ari was saying, was a discrete series of products. And that those products, let's use that word, we have to think then about how do we roll that out. So it's not just the implementation of it and saying, here it is, but also to say, okay, what we also have to do is, so what Rudolf was talking about in terms of an effective search engine for data, to then back that up by saying, right, we have a coordinated campaign of going to every major scientific conference to raise the profile of this. We have a coordinated series of documentation, and here's the training program that we run out for that. Because all of those things, and we think hard about saying, this is how we build up a community to support that. So that all those activities have to happen kind of, you know, that it's sort of thinking about that in that sort of strategic way, rather than sort of happening in a piecemeal type of way.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Andrew, I see you've just raised your hand, but we should move on unless it's a very brief point. Is it brief?
Possibly not sufficiently brief.
Well, okay. We can always come back.
All right.
To it
Okay. So very, very briefly, Owen made the point that unless we make EOSC and the services it provides very easy for users to use, they'll choose what they continue to use. It's the power of the default. I'd actually argue that what we need to do is we need to make anything we're offering them easier than what they currently use. That you actually need to make it negative friction, if I can put it like that. And the challenge for EOSC is that researchers sit at the intersection between the systems their institutions provide and the systems their disciplines require. And so EOSC is a third provider trying to fit itself into that balance between what they get at their desktop when they plug in and what their career path is telling them they have to do. And fitting into both of those environments is a significant challenge.
Yeah, no, very good point. I think that also picks up on some things that Neil said in chat, you know, like it's also not very clear sometimes for people anything about EOSC, who's providing it, how it'll be accessed, what it costs to use. So it's kind of complicated. So I'll move on to the second question, which is about the priority actions that we should be focusing on. I'm going to kind of go to the middle of the panel, start with the next lady. So I'll start this time with Shalini and run through the same order from there.
Absolutely. So I have also three priority actions that I think we have to focus on. And the first one is, you were talking about EOSC is multi-everything, right? So, and also communicating what goes under is not always useful, but adding to that, it might be useful to channel the communication for different groups in a different way. For example, regarding the architecture, it might be useful to improve the communication on what kind of architecture it might be, because institutions will have to make some choices on their infrastructure to be interoperable with EOSC, while for researchers, the communication could be more on the value proposition. So I think EOSC first should work a lot on communication. It doesn't need to be one thing fits for all. That might not work. So it has to prioritize how they communicate with different groups. And also the second one regarding researcher engagement, it could also be useful to think about how do we engage them in a small scale projects in terms of for them to develop fair practices in these projects, try to test interoperability, because being perfect is very good, but coming from a startup world, we do lean approach. We start with a minimum viable product, test with users, have a beta version, be clear about, you know, this is working version, try it out, give us your feedback, have focus groups. So some modular approaches in developing should be also another priority. And the third one is, this is more cultural. It's very important because I've worked in the Netherlands and now I'm working in Italy, and I see so many differences in terms of how open science is viewed. In the Netherlands, I think they're very advanced. They have a lot of bottom-up approaches and also a lot of top-down approaches, because a lot of university managements support open science practices, the government is supporting open science practices, and also there are lots of research communities, so they're coming together very well. But in countries like Italy, or just representing Italy here, it's still difficult to express or at least convince researchers about the benefits of open science. There's a lot of cultural awareness to be reduced, and also universities are just about figuring out what open science means for them. So there's a really huge gaps in how it's being implemented. And also me working with researchers, it's very difficult for me to convince to remove their hard disks and put their data into their data centers. So that's that also happened in the Netherlands. But so this level of changing the culture, both at a top down and also bottom up, is a huge challenge. Maybe it's not EOSC's mandate to do that, but that will really depend, the success of EOSC will depend a lot on the awareness of these topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shalini. So next up, Owen.
Yeah, so some of this sort of recapitulates what I was saying earlier, so I'll try not to go too deep into that. I still think that we have to work on the financial question from the provider side. It's just, we have a very clear timeline. If we don't solve the financial question before the project funding runs out, then we have an issue. We have a model for EOSC Core because it looks like this will be procured by the Commission, but for EOSC Exchange to be viable, it needs to have something working and in place before the project's end that are currently basically subsidizing the service development. I think on the sort of EOSC Exchange services offered side, there's also a big issue about data in the exchange. A lot of the work that came from the infrastructure side was very service focused. I say this having been on that side myself. And one thing I've been thinking just in the last couple of days is that we really do need to sort of work out how we're gluing the services and the data together. There is a huge amount of data to share, to exploit, to govern. How we do that in the EOSC Exchange right now isn't super clear, even though obviously we all know the data is very important. We know we want it to be fair, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some sort of harmonization work to be done there. And I think the last thing, which really I was being reminded of by Shalini today, what we are missing, and I think we're missing it in EOSC Future to some extent, which worries me, is not communication, but sort of user consultancy and engagement. We don't have people who are going out, taking the services to research groups and showing how you can map from their research to this service. A marketing department is not something we've ever really had as EOSC or in the research area. We're quite good at communicating about projects, and we can tell people about our services, but we can't do that kind of last mile stuff. I think this is quite successful at a national level, but I don't really see this being done at a European level. And I don't think otherwise we're going to convince people. As Andrew was saying, you know, we have to make these things easier than using what they're using already, or at least we need to show the benefits so clearly they'll make the effort. And I don't think they'll do that on a mail shot. I think that is going to require person-to-person contact. So yeah, there's many other things I could say, but I think the financials, dealing with data and how it connects to services, and something like consulting with research performing organizations and researchers would be really critical things for me.
Yeah, thanks very much, Owen. I think you're right there. That's one of these kind of key differences really when we look at the commercial sector. And Cellini had mentioned before about how they enable, you know, the commercial clouds enable SMEs to get started up, and they have a much more kind of user targeted and, you know, a marketing driven approach to make it clear how things can be used and how they fit. So next up, Hilary.
You have to bear with my bells until 12.
Oh
rings.
yeah, look, we're on the hour.
Sorry. They're just nearly there now. Okay, so actually my major priority, I mean, we have a SRIA, a strategic research and innovation agenda. We have a whole series of funding. So, you know, there is a logical and stepwise approach, which I more or less buy into. I think that's set out, but I think I'm going to tie into the one thing that Shalini, this is the worst time, sorry for speaking on live on a panel now, we have the call to mass, for those of you who are interested, is around communication. So, and Owen referred to it as well. I mean, and Ingrid said it before. So there's what, 255 people on this call. There's obviously 950 people, you know, registered, we hear, and we all know what's going on more or less, or yet we find out more in these 4 days and previous events. So I believe that one of the tasks that the association, if they have the bandwidth, the mandate, and I think it's a massive one, but it's worth doing, is investing in some innovative way of communicating and recording and making available all the different information that, you know, has gone to build EOSC. Why? Because we have a duty, first of all, to make that information known, and it should include the successes, the failures, the assets. Projects, you know, as we know, often go on, they finish 2 years, the sustainability, there's some sort of, what do you call that? You know, continuation of the work, perhaps in under another area or something. But I think that there's a lack of, and who do you go to contact? So, I mean, who knows that Ari asked me, for example, because he spoke first, you know, is someone that if you want to talk about something, you should go to him or whatever. I think we're missing that big piece of the pie that will really make it more also valuable, you know, to people. And also there's the multilingual aspect, which, you know, we did allude to. But we all speak in English. Those of us who are English speakers forget, you know, to slow down and be careful, but most of the researchers aren't, yeah, and I haven't heard much multilingual sort of ideas about it yet. So to me, that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, what a priority that seems to be further down the road, which of course is close to my heart and I think is fundamental, is the international alignment and the technical alignment specifically. There is great work being done in Europe and across the globe. Andrew, you know, is representing the Australian Research Data Commons, but there are so many. And the research and the scientists there are no borders. So in their particular communities, and we should, you know, underline that. So while the funding priorities or the SRIA says, the partnership says 2026, 2027, okay, but that's again putting the cart before the horse if we actually don't do something about it now. And of course, the Research Data Alliance, you know, can, I suppose, support that. I have one thing, because I mentioned interoperability before, and in the EOSC Future project, the Research Data Alliance has a funding possibility, an opportunity of a €1 million pool of funds. And so I'm going to do a call out to those of you on the call with ideas today, to the EOSC Association as well, because as we define the focus of those calls, as we see the gaps or the areas where we could leverage those funds and put them out for areas of interoperability, of engaging disciplines and communities that are less representative of testing, of doing some of the work that you said, Owen, it wouldn't be huge grants. But we are, the first calls are supposed to open in July, but they will be going on for the 30 months of the project. And I think that it's a really missed opportunity if we don't use this fund very well. So I do a sort of a call out for that. Of course, with the Research Data Alliance supporting it, the other thing is that there's a window to the world, if you like, and it would also support that international technical alignment. So I'll stop there.
Excellent, thanks, Hilary. And the bells have stopped. They were our call to EOSC to bring everybody in. Ingrid, next up.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, the key priority actions, I could give a quite simple answer, just flip around the 3 challenges I mentioned and you have your key priorities, but I'm not going to do that. Although I'd like to say a few more words about the engagement of users, also based on comments yesterday. I think we all agree that we need a direct input from scientists. They work with data on a day-to-day basis. And I think that we also shouldn't forget that these researchers have a huge amount of expertise. So we need to make sure that we engage with them also very much to our own advantage. And I think that it would maybe even be good to dedicate resources for more proper research into the needs and the practices of researchers in different communities as well. And also this point of communication, I talked about inclusiveness and the complexity. We need to communicate to researchers why EOSC should matter to them. I think Hilary alluded to that with her comments on incentives. We need to define concrete value propositions for them. And in all of that, I also think, and this was something that was mentioned to me again by a colleague of mine, that we need to show also a bit of modesty when we talk to the researchers, because I sometimes feel that we tend to forget that they are really the experts and they work with the data on a day-to-day basis. The next point I'd like to raise is not so much a priority action, it's more of a plea for more convergence and alignment. And this, I think, also involves a kind of cultural shift that might be already happening, but that we need to push further. Because I think we all still suffer a little bit from from what I would call the not invented here syndrome. I think we definitely need to build on and also integrate existing tools, existing project results, rather than reinventing wheels. And still, I see too many projects that have more or less the same goals and that come to similar outputs. I think it's important that we stimulate everyone to use and improve existing tools and standards and registries, etc. And in this context also, I think that we could highly benefit from a better kind of knowledge management within the EOSC realm. And I think Hilary also alluded to that across all the projects, so that we can easier identify who is doing what, where is what information, etc., etc. And what I also would like to see is that we move away from sometimes going on redefining things, and that we really proceed with implementation and that testing that you mentioned, Sarah. If I look at the First Fair project, we developed two tools, small tools, and they seem to be among the biggest successes of the project. So make doable things, little pieces, make them work and create an impact through them. So I think that's very important as well. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ingrid. And just to flag to everyone, just before we're going to have our final panelist now, Rudolf, you will get the opportunity to raise your hand. So think about your comments and questions. Rudolf?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. So what to say after all these comments, which I fully adhere to? Maybe just a simple back to the basics comment concerning fair data. I think, I probably all agree that without fair data, there is no EOSC. So somehow we have to make sure that fair data management is becoming the norm in Europe, everywhere. That I don't want to imply, that we are not on the way to it. There has been enormous progress in this area over the last couple of years. I still remember vividly the time when data was stored on USB disks, piled up on shelves, until actually the shelf comes down, crashing because of the weight. So a lot of data has been lost in this way. So we are definitely in a much better situation now, but there is still a lot to do, an enormous, we still have to make enormous progress. Fair is a daunting task, and we should not assume that this is a done deal. So I would definitely emphasize that we should not forget setting aside incentives and resources to work on fair and make it a prerequisite for open science. So we to implement this paradigm shift. And this, of course, can also go and has to go over the research performing organization. So we still need an incredible amount of groundwork, and I think I would like to refer to, the help we got at the ESRF from Fair's Fair for certifying all the data repository, and certification may be one of the avenues we could pursue to ensure that we have good fair implementations, which we can measure how we actually come along. So generalizing the need for repository certification could maybe even a top-down action, such as that it becomes a requirement for research infrastructures, universities, and so on. So maybe that's could be a possible path to stimulate the uptake of fair data management. However, again, I think we should definitely accompany this with a lot of training and outreach to explain what fair means day to day, and also technically how this is implemented, and then link it obviously to open science. The open science practice, and Shalini mentioned this, that we have a very diverse situation in Europe. There are cultural issues which have to overcome, and that's a long process. And we have to work on it, because this is, for me, really, again, a foundation on which we have to build the rest of EOSC. Without it, we don't have EOSC. So let's maybe not forget that. So I simply wanted to highlight that point. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rudolf, and all the other panelists. I think, again, some really interesting reflections. There are no hands raised, so I'll just start waffling in case anyone wants to raise a hand. I think there's been good points come up about the testing, again, doing, one small thing that works, as Ingrid had said, had come out of Fair's Fair. The last mile support that Owen had mentioned got a lot of discussion in the chat as well. And I wanted to pick up on some other points that had come out of the chat. So this idea that Andrew had put forward about, being frictionless, making sure that this flows for researchers, that the options we put forward are better than other options they have. And there was some kind of subsequent discussion on that about, how we can reduce the blood, sweat, and tears by integrating with existing systems. I think we have to acknowledge we're in a very complex environment. Researchers have services at their unis or, through their different discipline infrastructure, and we need to fit in with those. And there were also comments around, having support close to researchers. So the role of data stewards and support staff. And also comments came out about the role of national initiatives. And I think there's lots of different kind of mediators or groups that we could work with to try and facilitate uptake of EOSC. I haven't fully read of this microservices trend, but that seems to be getting a lot of comments in the chat as well. I think one thing we will do from this session is make the chat available so people can see that, as well as the recording and the comments from the panel.
Sarah, can I say something
yeah,
while you're
of course
just
you
on
can.
the mention of the frictionless, which and to offer them something that is better than what they have already. To a certain extent, I agree with that, but to a certain extent, I don't, because we all know that we know the commercial services that exist. I think good partnerships, open partnerships with commercial services could be a good idea, but we're talking about something very complex that I don't think they have to deal with all the different nuances that have been brought up here. And we're talking about research, publicly funded, data and research outputs. So of course, you're bound by certain legislation, certain regulations. I think that's easier said than done. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it's easier said than done. That I think it's the value that Shalini also referred to is the most important thing, and saying to them this minimal viable. It's a beta, it's a whatever, help us build it to your requirements, help us make it better, but it will give you all the trust, the security, the quality, all those things that you need. So I think the balance between those two are we're not building Uber, we don't have, or Google, we don't have the money, unfortunately. I'd love to know how much money has been invested in their particular.
Yeah, way more than the budget we have, I'm sure.
And of course they're easy to use, but so I think, if I may say that.
Yeah, no, of course you can. Shalini, you want to come in?
I just want to add a little bit on that. I mean, let me be optimistic here, because there's a lot of value for EOSC, and we are looking at the business model and the sustainability and all that stuff. And you should also not forget that it's not just the researchers who are willing to pay for these services. Also, companies might pay for these services, because there are some aspects which EOSC can uniquely offer, like data sovereignty. If you want to keep the data in Europe, if it's highly sensitive, if it's there are a lot of regulations also. If we use it to our advantage, we could also let companies pay for services of EOSC. So there are also stuff that Google cannot offer that we can,
Excellent. So there are no hands raised. I'm going to move us on to the third question. And I'm going to start with the final lady to be the first starter, which will be Hilary. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to try and keep this to 1 minute so we have lots of time for the mentee, because it is only one thing that you're changing. So if you had a magic wand and could change one thing to make EOSC better, what would that be? So your starter for 10, Hilary.
Okay. What would it be? Yeah, well, I know you told me the questions before. I still have a problem with this, because I actually buy very much into the EOSC vision. Yeah, I do. And I do believe that, you need the progress. So I think 10 years, what has the progress been made? I think if I could change one thing, it would probably be more open and more inclusive as we go along. I think that I don't think anyone does it on purpose to keep it closed or anything like that, but we're so, everybody's doing their piece of the work. But I think openness and inclusiveness, supports the non-duplication of efforts, building on other people's practices and things. So if you could, I think I would, like to turn back the clock and change that thing there, make it more open, inclusive, and engaging as it goes on, even though we're still building something. So making something better that isn't yet there is a hard answer to give. So I'm not sure
No, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think this has been one of the big successes of RDA, that it is open and inclusive, and it does kind of, it doesn't sit comfortably sometimes when open science projects are not open. So I think it's something that we have to have at the heart of all of the work that we do, and it came out very strongly in that opening session. So I think, like you say, it's not sometimes that people are intending to be closed, but we have to practice what we preach. Okay, so next up then is Ingrid.
Thanks, Sarah. Magic wand that made me think of fairy tales, and I love fairy tales, so I made one up myself, and I'll tell you in 1 minute. So first of all, if I had a magic wand, I think making the EOSC better would not be amongst the top 3 of my priorities, to be honest. But if it was a wand that would only work in the context of EOSC, I think I would use it to materialize the EOSC by combining the best of the public and the private worlds. A commercial player would probably give me a quick and agile delivery of really a very attractive EOSC end product. But there would probably be issues with openness and around consensus, etc. Now, in the public realm, we are building an EOSC that is open and inclusive and based on community consensus, which is incredibly valuable. But that, of course, also comes with a price as well. And we discussed that price more or less, I think, in this session. So it would be great if we could diminish the complexity of the process and the enormous amount of talking that we need and the red tape around it. Because all of that makes progress really slow. And you can sometimes, I think, hardly see things moving forward at all. So with my wand, I would brew a magic concoction with public and private herbs, maybe some private snake blood and a public crocodile tooth that would create an open and inclusive EOSC based on community consensus and with a wonderful ease of use, and get it done before the end of the year.
Perfect. I love all of those analogies. I think we need Ava Mendes to draw us a picture like her mushroom open science picture of this concoction that we're going to brew. So Rudolf, that's a hard act to follow.
Absolutely, yes. So I would also say that I would not use my magic wand for EOSC. I have other ideas in mind, maybe more important. But let's assume that we only can use it for EOSC, and then also let's assume that we don't really need it for EOSC, because then we're in bad shape, I suppose. Maybe I mean, dreaming, I would maybe go into the direction of an EOSC which is not driven by IT specialists, but by scientists, researchers. And they would actually tell us what their needs are. And we would have to respond to these requirements. And that would give us legitimacy to do this on behalf of the scientific community. And we could dream that then EOSC could become a research infrastructure which could even find its place on the S3 roadmap as a project, stable, sustainable, with a governance which is like a company, like a research infrastructure. So maybe that's something one could dream of. I'm pretty sure this is unlikely to happen, because the researchers are focusing on their research, and for doing that, they do whatever is easy and maybe unavoidable, and but not what costs them a lot of effort. In particular, coordinating with all these strange people all around the place. So it's a sort of catch-22, and I suppose we first have to implement something which works and then promote its usage in the scientific communities. And then be very attentive of what kind of feedback we get and to act on it. And this feeds back to what you said, Sarah, in the beginning, testing, with this feedback loop and trying to make it better and better. So that's, I think, it. I still would use the magic wand for something other than EOSC.
Yes, I should have specified this in my question. We might not want to use it for EOSC, but yeah. Shalini, next up.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I agree with all the previous answers. So I'm just going to be a bit more provocative, and I say I'll go back in time and change the name, because it's not a cloud. So probably that, and it's also related to communication, make it more obvious and less confusing. So at least that would be my one magic wand. It's a short answer. So
yeah, no, we can be like Prince, the artist formerly known as. And we have discussed this whole problem of EOSC, that it's not any of what the letters define it as, and propose that it's about a commons, not a cloud. So it's not about this kind of technical solution. It's this community and this consensus and commons. Owen, next.
So I'm going for time travel as well. I like all of these options. Mine's maybe more boring or pragmatic. I think that I would take all of the working group, task force, governance level part of EOSC and magically move it back in time before the implementation projects, because this has been the biggest struggle from my point of view, that we've been trying to constantly basically change the wheels on the bus while we're driving it down the Autobahn. We have really great input coming from working groups, task forces, expert groups, but we've already funded the projects. In fact, they were fixed when the funding call was set 5 years before. So we have a clash of the project wants to do what it is supposed to do according to its contract and is really open to change in as much as it can change it, but it can't change it that much. It has that budget, it has those partners. But there are things which we just didn't foresee or couldn't have foreseen, perhaps. Certainly we couldn't have foreseen COVID, but you know, having standards that we agree for certain things would have made a huge difference in making implementations more palatable and more interesting to users and providers. So that would be my my magic change, even though I know it is sadly unrealistic. But we just have to do our best, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you've hit upon like one of the major challenges we've faced in EOSC, that, you know, we're kind of building it as we go, and actually having heard from Edith about essentially how the legislation's passed, how the work programs are defined. You know, things are agreed years and years before these calls are actually coming out, and then obviously, as you said, projects have their work plans specified, and then it's only later we're trying to coordinate. So it's a very, very challenging environment that we've been working in, and hard to kind of make things coherent and bring them together, because, you know, we're not responding to something that was just came up a couple of months ago. You know, we're responding to things that were agreed years before, and they might not reflect the current practice and issues. So finally, Hilary, yeah? Or did you start? I'm lost on my track now.
But can I say something, Owen? I liked your changing the wheels on the bus, you know, while on the autobahn. But I think we should be more, what do you call that, ambitious, and say that we're changing the wheels on the Ferrari as it goes around the, you know, the racing track. What do you think? We're building a Ferrari.
Well, I think
we're building high-class
changing
EOS.
the wheels on 37 different vehicles of different sizes for all of the different communities. And the strange thing is, we're really quite good at it now. It's an unacknowledged skill we all have.
And we are driving on a German autobahn without speed limit.
Yeah.
I love the number of kind of visual images that have come out in this final round. We have half an hour or more than half an hour for the Mentimeter, which is fantastic. So I will invite, I don't know if anyone from the floor wants to share their view. What would you change? You might have had an idea in your head. By all means, raise a hand. This will be a question on the Menti as well, but I can tell you for sure I won't be able to read through all the comments in quick succession. So if anyone wants to raise a voice, I'm going to be quiet for a minute while people can think and raise a hand. And if not, I'm going to set up the Mentimeter in the background. You're all awfully shy. You know, we need EOSC to be a collaboration. Well, here we go.
Everybody's gone to lunch.
I know, everyone's switched off. Are you actually still here? We're just looking at lots of photos on screen. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again, and hopefully you're all ready to interact. So we have these 3 questions in the Mentimeter. So let me go to present this. Now, I predefined some options. These options might not be the right options. But you, like the panelists, you get to choose 3 challenges facing EOSC. Now, I've put some in here based on things that we thought would come up in discussion. So lack of consensus across stakeholders. We've talked about, you know, the number of stakeholders we have, the time it needs to build that consensus. Poor alignments between governance and implementation. So we talked about this issue of the cart coming before the horse, and how many different wheels we're trying to change as we're driving down the Autobahn. Perhaps a mismatch in expectations and what's feasible, understanding user or researcher needs. I just see a comment in chat. Have we used our allotted hands? I can't actually see the panelists anymore, the people anymore, but if somebody wants to speak out, I'm very happy for somebody to just unmute and speak out. I would even let Andrew speak out, even though he's had a point already, because I did cut him off briefly earlier on because I was concerned about time and letting everybody do the Menti. So if anyone wants to unmute, by all means do. Other options, gaining users, the uptake being something that we need to kind of build on, being intuitive, standards and interoperability. So the researcher needs is running forward here. It's kind of like watching a horse race. Where are all the dots going to go? Which ones are going to take the lead? We've had 30 votes so far, 33 now, and I think there's a couple of hundred people. So I'm going to give this a few minutes to come through. If any panelists want to reflect on what's happening on the Menti as well, by all means unmute and speak. So the user
Sarah,
needs. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
The trouble with other is you only get to say other. You don't say what your brilliant other idea is.
Well, I had that in mind. I'm ahead of you here. I was going to invite the 3 people who said other to raise their hands. So were you one of those other people?
I was not, and how could I have doubted that you would have been ahead of me?
So researcher needs coming top still, the standards and interoperability and consensus next. Does anyone who picked other want to be bold and tell us what that other is? You're all shy. You can also put it in chat.
I think Sarah and Neil has his hand up.
Oh, okay. I can't see the hands.
Yeah,
I
so
can't see panelists once I share screen. So if somebody else could invite people who raise a hand.
Yeah, Neil's first and then Hugh.
Okay, super.
Yeah, I was one of the people who put something in other, and it may be that it's actually quite close to poor alignment with governance and implementation. But I think my other was that the minimal viable products that we might be thinking about producing and that may be funded to be produced may not be the same minimal viable products that the wider community is looking for at that point in time.
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes to that issue of often the work programs and priorities are defined, years earlier. So there can be a mismatch between what's actually needed at the time because things change very quickly. We've seen, like obviously with the current situation we're all in with the pandemic, that changes priorities. So Hugh was next from recollection.
Yeah, so I guess this lies somewhere between understanding user needs and uptake of, gaining users is about building communities of researchers so that they have a feeling of ownership towards EOS.
Yeah,
much in the same way that researchers love the Python ecosystem or whatever, that they're really contributing towards it in that respect.
Yeah, I think that ownership is key. I think people invest a lot more. And was there another hand raised, Hilary, or somebody if you can assist? Françoise?
Yes, I have a comment. I could have said understand user researcher needs, of course, but I think that it's not only understanding them, it's fitting with them, fulfilling them. So I would prefer to be more precise or to have a second box allowing to say this has to fit users' need. So of course, as a starting point, one has to understand what the user's needs are.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not sure if there's another hand, but there is a comment from Corin in the chat that the other noted here was a gap between researchers from great institutions and those with poor identity infrastructure. Yeah, I think maybe one of those multi-dimensions I could have flagged is the fact that, we're not all on a level playing field. Does anyone else who had another or any other hands raised?
Well, I was just going to comment that I think Françoise is right, but what she's essentially doing is bridging between understanding users and research needs and uptake and gaining users, because in fact, those two, there's a dependency between them, and meeting their needs is somewhere between the two. So you could almost put those two together for by far the winner of the Mentimeter, I think.
Yes, yeah, definitely, because that kind of researcher needs has come up very strong, and also the gaining users is quite big. It's good that standards and interoperability, I think, also came out very strongly. This got commented on in the very early session, and bridging between those standards. I think some communities don't have their standards in place already, so we need to support the development of those, but we also need to, to map across the different standards and enable the cross search that was flagged by Rudolf, or, the combining different data. Okay, so I'm going to move us through to the second question, which you may already have been able to answer. Yes, we do have some comments. Only 49 people have answered this yet. It takes a little bit longer answering the scales. But what we've tried to focus on here is what people think the priorities are. So this viable business model for cross-border services, this came up a couple of times in Owen's comments. That's got a good rating there. Actually, the highest one, the researcher engagement, it's good that, people like you as an audience are seeing research communities as a priority as well. For me, that's definitely what needs to be at the heart of EOSC. We need to be working closely with research communities, engaging researchers and understanding their needs. And I think there's quite a few different groups that we could work through. So intermediaries we could work with to do that. So, the different institutions and the data stewards that we have there, and also the different domain groups, so learned societies or domain kind of representative bodies. Next on the list there, so the facilitating uptake via policies and funding. I think that's a good way to do it. We'll actually reflect on, you might not have seen it in the chat, in the very first question we had, Sean Devitt was being a little bit provocative, saying, the funding, you should be forced to use EOSC, that should be part of the funder's policy. And there was some kind of concern about, if you force somebody to use something, what if it doesn't work? I think you have to have the carrot and the stick. It's good for policies to incentivize things, but we have to make sure that it fits research practice if we do have a strong steer in that way. And then incentives for standards adoption, that's growing. It was at 3.8 a second ago. Still getting some more comments in here. I think we hit about 80 on the first one, so I'm maybe going to move on in a moment. There was, some people had put something for other, maybe, or maybe it's just a scale. Does anyone want to raise a hand or reflect on this session on priorities? Are there any hands raised?
No, but I think Timea put up one in the other.
Okay.
Understanding where various research communities are and how they are progressing, which is quite interesting. And if I may give a shout out for Timea and the Digital Repository of Ireland, who are actually doing work on that in trying to lay a foundation for work that will continue in the EOSC Future project about those research and science communities that aren't involved in the S3 roadmap and involved in the project. Where are they and what's their awareness levels of EOSC and readiness as well to interact with them. I think she's going to speak about it on Friday, but in any case, I think it's a good starting point to make available to the.
Yeah, and there was some work that came out of the FAIR working group in the previous governance. I always forget the title of the report, but it's something like 6 recommendations on FAIR practice, and that had looked at the different domains, where they had standards in place for FAIR, where they were adopting FAIR practices and where there were gaps, so that we could identify essentially the readiness of different research communities and where investment needs to be made. And I think that's really important to understand, where people are at and how they're progressing. Good point, Timea. Okay, I'm going to come to the final question or comment, the third question. What one change would make EOSC better? Okay, so stop restricting the development of EOSC to the in-groups, such as EOSC Future. I think there is a huge concern that's kind of coming out about, being in the in crowd or speaking, into the vacuum, not being open and inclusive. And I think that's something that, we really have to address. More implementation, some specific communications in social science and humanities. We did have a comment before about, different disciplines, making sure things fit for different communities. The EC should be overhauled to allow and accommodate agile lean development. I think that would be fantastic. I don't imagine we're going to get that to happen, but we can maybe try and be more agile and lean within EOSC. I'm not sure we're going to get the EC to be lean, because as I've mentioned, the agreeing things with all the member states and, defining the work programs and priorities and the budgets is a huge, multi-year process. having a clearer definition on EOSC that can be communicated to researchers. This, interestingly, is something that Uta had flagged. So Uta, the new Secretary General, it's something that she'd mentioned in the interview process. And I think this is something that's close to her heart as well. So hopefully that's one change that we will be seeing happen. If we can't agree to a single standard, we should at least have some minimum standards and metrics. That's something we've tried, to make recommendations on, for instance, within the FAIR group and what we put out there, the FAIR metrics. And I think that idea of the community standards and mapping across them, that being a key area of work, also comes out. To have a well-defined scope rather than trying to be all things to all people. Yeah, I think we have, perhaps bitten off more than we can chew with EOS, because it's all countries, all disciplines, all, data types. And yeah, it is definitely a challenge. Better communication, organizing access to the open cloud for communities not already reaching out to this. Starting with usable services. Yeah, I think this idea of being incremental came up a lot. Needing to be much simpler for researchers, clearer value proposition, one website for all EOSC related information. Wouldn't that be nice? Understandably, every project has their own website, but I think this has caused a lot of confusion for lots of people. Highlighting the benefits for people, this idea of the value proposition to come up a lot. Defining some pilot MVPs and implementing them quickly one by one. Again, this idea of, I think, being, a bit more agile and iterative and flexible within EOSC. An elevator pitch that we can all reuse. Again, coming back to the communications. Active work on the cross-border policy of sensitive data. Yeah, I think there's lots of really challenging areas. So this idea about access to services across borders, how we're reimbursing the costs of running those services, and also things like using sensitive data across borders. It's very challenging from a policy side, not just the technical issues. Making EOS services directly accessible without having to navigate the many EOS projects or filing formal requests in the EOS marketplace. Make EOS services open. This is what we're trying to get to. Things should be seamless, very easy to access. I think it's not there yet, but hopefully that is something that will come in time. Trying to understand and think like the researchers. Yeah, I think we definitely need to get more research viewpoints in here. The KISS principle, keep it short and simple, or simple. For stupid people.
Stupid.
It's simple and stupid. I couldn't remember exactly what. Keep simple and stupid.
No,
yeah.
Simple stupid.
Simple stupid. Thank you very much, Shalini. What else? We have more about researcher needs here. Sell it better, involve the researchers, providing practical solutions for doing FAIR at the researcher lab level. Needing to increase researcher engagement, links to national and regional ecosystems. I think, again, this is a good kind of facilitator or intermediary we could use. There's lots of national infrastructure, there's lots of regional projects within EOSC. I think that's a good way to connect up. Adopting more bottom-up approaches, agility, putting users in the driving seat on our fantastic bus with all the changing wheels, or our Ferrari, more like. Focusing on added value. Wow, there's quite a lot of these.
Sarah, can I make one comment?
Yeah, go ahead, please do.
Just something I noticed, kind of meta message. There was quite a few comments saying EOSC services should do this, or we should push them in this direction. I think that there's a misunderstanding. Also, being involved in EOSC Future, which I appreciate, is a bit of a black box to a lot of people who aren't already in it. It had a very strange start, and this made things more complicated. The work in EOSC Future isn't about the services for scientists in the exchange in the main. It's about consolidating EOS core. Now, there is work to bring those services in, but the services will still sit with the people who develop them, from the ESRI clusters, from individual research performing organizations, from the infrastructure organizations. So I think one of the challenges we have is in doing things like, there was a discussion of moving beyond pilots to a small set of valuable services. sure, I agree, but that has to come from the people who make those services. That isn't really what's being funded in the current raft of projects, either EOSC Future nor at least the regional EOSC projects either. Maybe slightly more in the cluster project. So it is kind of a marketplace, and I think, or an open market, as it were, rather than a kind of monolithic. This is what you get, EOSC. This is what you get part is the core, the boring parts, which hopefully no one will look at after a while because they are like the power grid that we were discussing earlier on. And I think that maybe this misunderstanding kind of drives some comments, which are then very hard for the people doing the core to actually address, because that's not what we're doing.
Yeah, good point. So I'm going to stop the Menti in a second, but I'm just going to highlight my favorite comment that I've seen in the Menti. With a magic wand, I would erase the collective memory about EOSC so we could approach the implementation of its vision that we all support with fresh brains. I think the legacy sometimes causes us problems, and I think we do need to try and approach things with a fresh mind, and as many people flagged, make sure we're responding to researcher or to user needs. Okay, so I'm going to stop screen share because I must admit it's very disconcerting not being able to see anyone or the hands. And I'm going to ask, we have 15 minutes left. I'm going to ask if anyone wants to raise a hand either to make a comment on things that have been said today, or if one of the panelists wants to say anything else, or we all get an early lunch. Would anyone like to raise a hand? Yeah, Shalini?
Thank you, Sarah. Actually, there's one thing I wanted to add in addition to the discussions we had today, and I think I noticed it quite a lot in Europe. There is this industry versus academia, us versus them attitude. It's like we will do our things, and there's the commercial stuff. And I haven't seen very good practices where they come together, because sometimes we can't just do everything ourselves, and sometimes we cannot fully depend on the commercial partner. So I saw that President von der Leyen spoke about EOSC as the data economy. It's going to drive the data economy of Europe. And if that's the case, in terms of inclusiveness, are we just limiting it to researchers and academic partners? Or so this is just a comment, probably a bit tangential to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? I see Rupert has his video on, which I didn't notice before. Do you want to mention anything, Rupert? No, you're just unmasked. Well, maybe what I'm going to do then, I just received a WhatsApp that unmasks the person who made that fantastic comment. It was Sarah Garavelli. So thank you to Sarah for the best comment in the Mentimeter. Thank you to all the panelists for everything that you've put into your thoughts and reflections, and also to all of you. There's been fantastic content in the chat, many useful reflections, and it's been a very interesting session, so thank you very much.